Chag Sameach. Okay, this is Man Simchatenu. It's a time of our great joy. So I hate to interrupt that for a minute here, but we live in difficult times. So let's just kind of say some of the things, right? So unlike in Harry Potter, where we don't mention the bad guy's name because it's too scary, let's just call it what it is. We have a plague going on in this world, a real plague, right? This disease that is dangerous, it's infected lots of people, and it's killing people, and now even our president. We have a plague in our country. That plague is causing social isolation. That's why we don't have a full sanctuary. Of course, during the holidays during the week, we don't necessarily have a full sanctuary anyway, but we didn't have a full sanctuary on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It was empty hallways. And we certainly don't have as many people coming on Shabbat as we used to. And even on Chag, we have more people in the sanctuary than we do today. We're not gathering together to pray. We're not gathering with our friends in large numbers generally to have lunch and other kind of social events anymore. And some of us are actually staying home most of the time. So we're much more socially isolated than we've ever been, and that's depressing. There's uncertainty. For some people, there's job insecurity. For some people, there's health insecurity. Other people there's political uncertainty for sure right now. We have environmental challenges, fires from the West Coast, floods in the Gulf, and other kinds of environmental upheaval. And then we have a plague of trying to understand what truth is. That could be the subject of a whole different sermon. I don't want to go into a lot of detail on that now, but suffice to say something we are all aware of, I think, is confirmation bias. We're sort of psychologically programmed to believe things that resonate with something we already believe. When we hear something new, if it resonates and it confirms our biases already, we say, yeah, that's real. We don't stop to think about it. And if it sort of attacks something that we believe is real, that we fundamentally believe is true, and we hear something that it disturbs us about it, we reject it automatically. We don't stop and think about it. That's called confirmation bias. And in a world where there is a miasma of misinformation on the internet, and trust me, there is a miasma of misinformation on the internet coming from all sides, this is really dangerous. We no longer have a direct sense of what's true and real, and that is also confounding and upsetting. So all of these different things can lead to despair. But as I said at the beginning, this is Man Simchatenu, the time of our great joy. And I'm a rabbi, and I'm supposed to bring you some uplifting and inspirational ideas. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to turn to our prayer book. And we're about to do Hoshanot. These are special prayers where we ask God to Hoshana, save us, or help us, please. And interestingly enough, this tradition of singing Hoshanot goes back to temple times. They used to do this in Second Temple period. The Mishnah records that they would draw water from the Shiloach pool and they'd pour it over the altar in the temple, and the priests would circle around the altar and sing Hoshanot, while the Levite choir was singing with them and the Levite orchestra was playing music, and it was a big celebration and a big party. And they're singing and dancing and they're singing, save us, please help us. And the first question you might have is, that's an odd thing to say if you're happy and and you know it, right? You're supposed to, if you're happy and you know it, you're supposed to clap your hands. But they're singing, save us, right? So what are we asking God to save us from? The simple answer with the pouring of the water is they wanted the rain to come. This is supposed to be the beginning of the rain season. And so they're praying to God that it should rain. And because our ancestors didn't understand really the weather, and they certainly couldn't control the weather, they wanted to do something because, they understood that human beings are supposed to be God's partners. We're supposed to be God's agents in helping to make things happen in the world. So they felt like they had to do something to help the rain come. So they draw water from the Shiloach pool, and they pour it over the altar to say, this is how it's going to rain. And then they would sing and dance because they knew that God was going to be there for them. So I want to take a look now at these Hoshanot prayers, and maybe we can find inspiration. We don't believe that we can control the weather by pouring water on the ground. but perhaps we can draw some other inspiration from these Hoshanot prayers. So if you have a prayer book at home, in the Lev Shalem, it's on page 383. And if you don't, I'm sorry, I'll try and repeat some of the words here and then give you some of a commentary. Okay, so the Hoshanot begin with 4 sentences. Hoshana lama'ancha Eloheinu. Save us or help us for your sake, our God. The first thing I want to point out is it's for God's sake. We're asking God to help us for God's sake, not for ours. Because, as they used to say in an old Saturday Night Live sketch, we're not worthy, we're not worthy. Right? We're not so holy that we expect that God will be there for us because we are tzaddikim, righteous people. We know we're flawed characters, but we know that God cares about us. And so because God cares about us as a parent cares for their children, no matter what they do, we ask God to be there for us. And then they use 4 different names for God. Eloheinu, our God. Boreinu, our creator, reminding God that he created us, right? This is what your children will say to you. Or if your children, what you say to your parents, you made me, aren't you going to be there for me? Goaleinu, our Redeemer. And we remember specifically that he redeemed us from slavery in Egypt. That's the paradigm. If he could take slaves out of Egypt, he can help us now. And then Dorshenu, which is an interesting expression here. Dorshenu is, he seeks after us. He doesn't just, see the people who are in front of him. He goes after, pursues every one of us. He's interested in each one of our concerns. He seeks after us. He cares so much about us. And I just want to point out one other thing about this before I leave it, and that is, as most of the ancient prayers are, it's alphabetic. So, Eloheinu, Boreinu, Goaleinu, Dorshenu is Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled. First 4 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. That's the first part. That's the introduction. Then is Hoshana, and these were done, by the way, intentionally as short little phrases, 2-word phrases, and then the congregation responds Hoshana. They wanted everybody who's watching, the priests singing and dancing around the altar, to join in. Hoshana, that's the congregational response. And again, this is a 2-word statement, and it's alphabetic. Lema'an amitecha, with an aleph. Lema'an britecha, with a bet. Lema'an gadlecha, gadlach, with a gimel. And lema'an datach, right, with a dalet, so and so on. So the entire alphabet is here, not just the first 4 letters. So we're asking God to help us with all the letters of the alphabet. And I also want to point out that the first one, amitecha, is for the sake of your truth, right? One of the issues we're confronting today is what is truth? What does it mean when they say God's truth? God's truth is the ultimate truth. God is not a Democrat. God is not a Republican. God isn't on Fox News, and he's not on MSNBC. God is the truth. God sees the whole picture, the complete picture. And perhaps when we say this, as in a few minutes we're going to pray this, we can pray to be inspired from God's perspective to help us to understand what's real and what's true in this world. I want to point out another one, and just another phrase, and we'll go to the next one. Lema'an ve'udcha, this is the vav line. Lema'an ve'udach, right? And va'ud is kind of a weird construction there, but it comes from the Hebrew root for moed. As in Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting that our ancestors used when they wandered in the wilderness. That was the tent of meeting, the central tent where God's presence would be experienced. But Moed is, of course, also the term for the festivals. The Shlosha Moedim, right? This is Moed, right? It's a festival. And so we encounter God not only in a specific place, in a tent of meeting, later in the temple, and now in our sanctuary here, we also experience God at appointed times and seasons, like our festivals, like Sukkot. Time and space. And so even though, again, this kind of relates to our situation today, we are isolated, not everybody's here in the sanctuary now, we can't come to our appointed place to experience and meet God, but this is an appointed season, Sukkot, the time for us to meet God because of the holiday. And so it kind of has this dual context of both space and time. Now we're going to go to the second one, and this is the most astounding one of all. It's on page 385. Very audacious of the rabbis. Ani v'ho Hoshanah. Very confusing statement there. What is ho? That's the question. What is the word ho in Hebrew supposed to mean here? Ani v'ho Hoshanah. Ani means I. Hoshana means save us, please. What is v'ho? So some people suggest this is another way to say Ana Adonai. Ho could be God's name, short for God's name, Yud, He, Vav, He. So the last two letters of God's name are He, Vav. And so maybe it's Ana Adonai. It's sort of like repeating the verse from the Psalms. Ana Adonai Hoshiana. Right? That's one way to understand it. But the Midrash understands it differently. And based on an interpretation of the Bible, the rabbis audaciously assert that when the Jews were in exile, first in Egypt and then in Babylonia, God was in exile with them. And the ho here is in fact God's name, but it's I and you, God. Save both of us. You need to save yourself because you are in exile, God, with us. Very audacious of the rabbis, but that is the common understanding of what this prayer is about. That we are both in exile now, and if God can redeem us, God can redeem God's self. What does that mean? Well, one thing it means is that God is wherever there are people who are suffering in the world. God is not on the side of the oppressors. God is on the side of the oppressed. God is with the oppressed people of the world. And God suffers when anyone in the world is being oppressed, because we're God's creatures. And so therefore, God wants to help those people because God isn't complete, God isn't whole, God isn't redeemed himself unless all God's creatures are redeemed. And that means God has empathy. And so in order to end God's suffering and our own, we need to be on the side of the liberators. Like God, we must have empathy for others and be God's agents of liberation. And that's, I think, the central meaning of this text. Once again, it uses an alphabetic acrostic, so it follows the Hebrew alphabet. Kehoshata, just as you have saved, Elim belod, right, with an aleph. Betseitcha is bet, right? And then in the next verse, Goy, Gimel, and Drushim, Dalid, right? So this is an alphabetic acrostic again. And all of the first letters of the alphabet through the Nun verse on the next page are dealing with God taking us out of Egypt. That's the paradigm of God taking us out of Egypt, rescuing us from slavery. And just as God rescued us in the past, we ask that God should rescue us now. What happens in the next verse, it's on page 386. I'll read in the English. As you rescued those who surrounded the altar carrying willows to adorn it, so save us. That's clearly a reference to the Hoshanot ceremony in the temple. By the way, this prayer was not written during temple times. It was written a few centuries after the temple was destroyed by the great poet Elazar Kalir, and he was himself felt in exile in the Byzantine Empire under the Byzantine rule. It was an oppressive time for Jews, and so his prayer is calling on God to rescue Jews from the oppression of the Byzantine Empire. Right? So just as he used to be with us when we had a temple and we used to dance around with our willows, save us now. And the next one is when you rescued the wondrous ark when it was violated, and in your anger you caused the violators to suffer. For those of you who don't know the story, it's kind of a funny story. It's about the Philistines who stole the ark. It's in the book of Samuel. He punished them with a particular illness, which we won't go into, and they sent the ark out back to the Israelites. Read it, it's a fun story. Okay, that's that one. Next, just as you were there with us in the exile in Babylonia, save us now. You were with us when we were exiled to Babylonia. That's the next two verses. You rescued the captured tribes of Jacob. That's also referring to the Babylonian exile. So also we ask that you rescue us now. And then there's the some add verse, right? You'll notice that the one just above it ends with tashuv. That's the tough verse. So that ends the alphabetic acrostic. And then it says some add. What is some add? This was added later to the poem. This is not from Elazar Kalir anymore. Somebody later added it. We're not exactly sure who, but we know his name. His first name. How do we know his first name? Because another clever trick that these poets used to do is they'd put their name in their poems. Okay, so take a look. Shomre is Shin, Mitzvot is Mem, Vachoche is Vav, El is Aleph, and Limoshaot is Lamed. His name was Shmuel. Do you see that? Shin, Mem, Vav, Aleph, Lamed. His name was Shmuel. He added this extra verse. So, you can add the extra verse. Now I want to conclude with the last thing is a couple of verses from the Bible. The first one is from Psalm 28:9. Hoshia et amecha uvarech et nachaltecha. Right? Save your people. And here's the key phrase at the end. Ureim v'nasem adolam. Re'em comes from ro'eh, which means shepherd. Shepherd us. What does a shepherd do? He guides sheep in the right direction. We're asking God to guide us in the right direction in the middle of the crisis we're dealing with. Help us to focus on what's important. Push us, because we need to be pushed. You know, we're a little depressed. We need a little energy. So push us, help us, guide us. Shove us in the right direction, v'nasem, and lift us up. We need to be uplifted. We need to be inspired. So we're praying to God to inspire us from now and forever. So the prayers in our prayer book can be seen to be addressing our situation now. We are being confronted with a number of things that I haven't seen in my whole lifetime. But it is Man Simchatenu. Today we're going to rejoice and we're going to sing this song and we're going to sing it with happy faces because it's Man Simchatenu. It's time for us to rejoice. That's what Jews do. We take good and the bad together. And so we're going to be happy. Tomorrow, we're going to use God's guidance, shepherding us, and God's spirituality to lift us up so that we can go out and make this world a better place, to be God's agents, to be with the oppressed, so that we can free the oppressed, and God will be free, and God will be saved, and we'll be saved. Hoshanot. Save us, please.